I know this chapter is just a lot of information, but we'll keep going. This is the end of it. Um, and like I say, like hopefully you don't have your notes aren't too extensive. Like hopefully you can limit it down because, like I said, you do not need to know, 5 controlling benefits. And a lot of it, since the start of this chapter, has been kind of common sense. So anyway, I asked you to look up national parks in Ireland, so I had a read of a few of them, and just there. They're good, they're interesting, like some I wouldn't have thought of. Um, okay, so we're going to just talk about food production here. So we did the chapter on climate change, and um, we were talking about population. When we also, it wasn't climate change chapter, it was the energy chapter, the one where we're trying to find new ways of generating energy because our fossil fuels are running out and our population is growing. So at the moment, there are about 7 billion people on Earth. Uh, oh, excuse me. This book is this book was only published in late 2019, so that is actually quite accurate. Um, it's predicted that the number of humans in 2050, okay, so we're in 2020, so 30 more years, we're going to be at 9 or 10 billion. That's a massive jump. Um, as the numbers rise, it will be expected to increase global food production. Okay, so obviously, if there's more people, we're going to have to figure out how to feed them. Um, and at the moment, feeding our population is one of the things that's contributing to global warming. So we need to figure out a way of doing it that's better than the way we're doing it now. Now, this isn't something that was in the old books. It was interesting. I didn't. I'd never heard about the Green Revolution, and perhaps you have, so I had to look it up. That's what's down here. But I did know this is not our. The population of Earth was actually growing faster in the kind of mid to late 50s. Um, so they had that problem then as well, where they were like, the population's growing at this rate, in this many years, we're going to have whatever amount of people, how are we going to feed them? But they had what was called the Green Revolution, and it resulted in huge increases in production of food worldwide. So here you are. Here, the Green Revolution started in 1965. It was first introduced. It was the first introduction of high-yielding variety seeds in Indian culture, and it was coupled with better and more efficient irrigation, watering, and the correct use of fertilizers to boost crops. So it was kind of the first time that anybody had attempted to farm on a commercial scale. So rather than just producing whatever, obviously in Ireland it would have been, a few potatoes and a few carrots and some onions and, like stuff that grows really well in Ireland, and you would have just produced enough for your family. Like if you even speak to your maybe not your grandparents, but they'd probably remember. I mean, I know, no, your grandparents definitely would remember that. Like, if you've any kind of grandparents that grew up anywhere outside of Dublin, like, the structure of the day and how they would have got their food and things like that was just so wildly different from what we know today. I mean, one of my dad would talk about like his mom getting a pig and at a certain time of the year, and they just ate that pig then. It was frozen and they just ate that pig for months, and things like that, rather than you go to the butchers and you get your meat as you need it. This would have been just totally different, and he would have been out at like 12 or 1 o'clock in the day and picked the dinner out of the garden, anyway. So that's how people farmed. They farmed for necessity. They farmed for their family. They farmed to keep people fed. And then in the between 1950s and 1960s, they developed this green revolution, which was improving the way they farmed, becoming more efficient, producing larger crops, things like that. Okay, there were problems though. So the number of crops fell dramatically as the new crops were planted. So they were planting these new crops which were producing higher yield, and there was kind of like a lull in production, I suppose. New crops needed large amounts of fertilizers and had to be sprayed with pesticides. So all of that needed to be, as in they were being done on such a large scale now that one person out, spraying the garden wasn't going to work. Like they needed, it's in the next one, they needed higher level farm technology, so tractors and sprayers. So again, if you drive down to um, any rural part of Ireland really, and you see a farm, it's not a small farm. You're talking about acres upon acres upon acres, and it just wouldn't be possible to do it, by hand and by foot. So it's all machinery. Um, they needed access to lots and lots and lots of water for irrigation, and so we were kind of talking about this with conservation the other day, but the land left grown naturally would have grown many species of plants, and there would have obviously been a lot of animals. And then that was like, animals, insects, all sorts in there. And that would have been changed then to growing a single crop. So an entire field growing rice, an entire field growing wheat, whatever it may be. That idea of, so you're taking a multicultural, like, there would have been plants, there would have been animals, there would have been insects, there would have been all sorts there, and end of all that, you're only planting one type of crop. So you would strip the field, plant one type of crop, and then obviously fertilize and insect repellent to kill anything that's going to come and try and eat it. So what are you doing? Massive loss of biodiversity there. So what's good for one thing is going to affect another thing. But like I said, if we're going to have between 9 and 10 million people, we're going to have to figure out a way of making more food. And then obviously attempt some form of conservation. So it feels like the impossible challenge, because you're trying to do both. Like, how can you possibly increase more yield but at the same time protect biodiversity? Anyway, so there's two ways. So converting more land to grow crops and increasing the yield that crops grown on present farmland. So either, plant another 2 fields, or make the field that you have planted, rather than producing, 1 ton of wheat, that it produces 1.4 tons of wheat. So increase the yield, increase the amount coming out of the land. So if you increase the actual land itself, so at present only 10% of the world's surface is used for growing crops. Hopefully you know this, about 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered in water. Then you have land that is too dry, like deserts, too hot, obviously deserts, too cold, your poles, your North and South Pole, or the soil is just not very good, it's not very fertile soil. So if you're using more land, like if you take it on a small scale, if you take one farmer in Ireland and he has to increase his crops, and he's going to, increase his land by 20%, that's another habitat that's been fragmented or destroyed, and that's another loss in biodiversity. So this option is not something that anybody's putting any money into, that option number 1. So what they're looking at is option number 2, increasing the yield of crops. So yeah, there's a whole lot of research going into this at the moment. Some involves using older crops that were preserved as seeds, and trying to develop new strains of crops. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to develop a crop that will, so for every plant that grows, that plant has more yield on it, has more product on it, whatever that product may be. So much of the research is attempting to develop new strains of crops by adding genes to existing plant crops. They want the new crops to produce increased yields, resist higher global temperatures. So the fact that we have a global warming problem and the temperatures are increasing, that is affecting yield in certain places. So like certain crops like colder temperatures to grow in, that's the way they grow. So if you then increase that temperature and they don't want to grow anymore, and you have a decrease in yield, that would be a disaster. So you need to make sure they can withstand those slightly higher temperatures. Try to figure out a way of using less fresh water, so that you're doing some kind of recycling of the water that's going on. I mean, there is a lot of work in there's a name on them, but basically they capture rainwater, filter it, and then use that. So, and then the water that's in the ground kind of sinks down and it's recaptured. So there is irrigation systems. They're very expensive, but you'd want every kind of farmer to be using them. Resist pests and diseases, so it would be ideal if the crop itself wouldn't be destroyed by the pests, because then you wouldn't have to use the pesticides, you wouldn't have to add the chemicals. If the insects could still live and just not damage the plant, would be ideal. And then, this is food we're going to eat, so an improved taste and contain more nutrients. I mean, if that isn't a list of it's literally, they're trying to build a super crop, that does everything by itself. So increase yield. That's ultimately what they want. But then they want it to cooperate with our new environment, so resist high temperatures, use less water because we don't want to be wasteful, resist pests because we don't want to be using pesticides and adding in those foreign substances, and all the while tasting better and being better for you. So it's a big ask. And then another thing they're trying to do is get plants to produce more than one crop a year. So again, if they're developing these plants, that they don't just get one crop a year, they might be able to produce 2 or 3. Okay, but it's all in production. So how do you reduce the food gap? So the food gap, it's in bold there, is the difference between the amount of food produced and the amount of food needed. So I suppose this up here, Mr. Supercrop, is like the absolute, this is what we need to do. But in the meantime, is there anything we can be doing? So food wastage, there's a big push on there recently about food wastage and the amount of food that apparently in Irish households that we throw out. There's a big push on the difference between the use by date and the expiration date, the best before and the use by date. That the best before doesn't mean throw it out if you've passed this date. Best before means it is at its best before this date, but it's not gone off after the date. That was a big kind of push to try and encourage people to eat as much of their food as possible and not throw it out. And even at the start of this pandemic, when people were kind of going to the shops and hoarding food, that was another big problem. They didn't want to see an increase in food wastage because people are buying huge amounts of food and it's going to end up going off because they're not used to having that quantity of food in their house. Another thing which has obviously been very topical as well is adjusting our diets. So it takes an awful lot more land to produce meat than it does to produce plants. So if we're trying to increase our food production, it would be much more efficient to grow more plants and raise less meat. So that's obviously pushing towards, and it doesn't need to be like a full-on vegetarian or vegan diet. It just needs to be that instead of having meat with every meal, that people could make those adjustments and maybe only have, I can't remember what the thing is they're recommending, but it's definitely a lot smaller than you think, like have meat 4 times a week or something, whereas most of us would probably have meat 3 times a day. So that's a massive adjustment. And then it depends on the population, or not the population, the culture. In Ireland, we are very much like a meat and 2 veg, kind of, that's how most of us were raised. It would be unusual to have a meal, like breakfast maybe, but sandwich at lunch, most people will put in, a bit of ham or something. And then your dinner, most of the time, it's kind of built around whatever meat is on the plate. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of vegetarians in our school, and but it is definitely a shift culturally because the vast majority of people would eat probably 2 servings of meat a day, which is 14 a week, and they're looking for us to eat closer to 4. So it's a massive shift. Increase our use of poor quality land. So again, that's a little bit of a toss-up between your biodiversity. if it's poor quality land, it doesn't grow a lot. You obviously don't have a huge amount growing there, so you're not going to be killing natural plants. And there may be animals and insects living there, so they may need to be looked at. But if you could get poor quality land that before was yielding nothing and is now yielding food, that would be great. And improve how we use our existing land and resources. That's what we're talking about there. Just create better plants, I suppose. Control human population increases. So I don't know that there's a massive drive on for that at the moment, but trying to stick it closer to 7 billion rather than push on to 9 or 10. It's a very, what's the word? A contentious issue, I suppose, when you talk about controlling populations, because they would have done a bit of this in China where they limited families to having one child and this kind of thing. So yeah, that's a topic for debate, I suppose, but a very heated debate. And increase our use of water-based food production. So aquaculture. So we don't do a lot of that worldwide. Okay, so that's it. Again, when you're doing the notes on this, do not even think about writing everything down. Clipped, short notes. So like, how can humans contribute to food? Here I'd be saying increase population, because of the increased population, we need to increase global food production, not the first time, and write down the green revolution. What are the problems? Again, like single words. So lull in crop production, single words, you know what I mean? Like snip sentences. Fertilizers, pesticides needed, that kind of stuff. Okay, so really clip the notes and just get the key information down. Is that okay? And I actually have an exam question for you to do, because that's the end of that chapter. Okay, so keep the notes nice and short, get down what you absolutely need in terms of studying and things like that, and give the exam question a go. It'll be due for Tuesday.